Installment of ontology engineering and intelligence analysis. This is part 2 of the bottom-up perspective. As you recall, we have approached ontology engineering and intelligence analysis both from the top down and the bottom-up perspectives. In the top down, we were focusing largely on upper level structures or high level perspectives on the domain, and now we're starting from the bottom and moving up with an eye towards the top by focusing on more of the domain level content that we would see in the field, things that should be more familiar to agents. But again, like as I've said, this is part of this a pincer movement, or a top-down, bottom-up perspective, which I like to call middle in. And with that, let's proceed. So today we'll be discussing more specifically the use of cognitive heuristics and the addressing of bias with them, as well as confirmation bias and serial position effects, and then arguments in the intelligence cycle. So by this, to get us started, just to think about cognitive heuristics and biases that may be associated with them, let's just take a moment and reflect on the following question. Are there more words in the English language that begin with the letter K or that have the letter K in the third position? I'll let you ponder that for a minute, but not too long. There are about 3 times as many words in English that have K in the third position, although they're quite difficult to call to mind. If you're thinking about them now, I suspect you were able to come up with many words that start with K, but not so many that have K in the third position. Like, right? There are actually quite a few of them. The bias or the heuristic that's used here that can trend into a bias is whatever's coming to mind, whatever the first things you can recall, like those first paradigmatic examples. Those are the things that your mind will gravitate towards when you're posed with questions of this sort. And this is not peculiar to language. This is just true in general. Your mind has paradigmatic examples or instances, prototypes or whatnot. They're more or less ready to hand whenever you're posed with life's challenges. Oftentimes this is good for you because that way you don't have to think or calculate or methodically care too much about answers to the many questions that the booming and buzzing environment throws your way on a day-to-day basis. Nevertheless, if left without if left unchecked, you may answer questions, somewhat artificial questions like this, incorrectly because of that availability reliance. Similarly, consider this. Do you think the number of African countries in the UN is greater than or less than 10? With that in mind, how many African countries do you think are members of the United Nations? Again, I'll give you a moment to reflect. But again, not too long. There are 54 African nations in the UN. Many provide a significantly lower number given the setup, as they've been anchored to the number being around 10. That first question really anchors you into thinking, well, it must be nearby. And because of that, if you don't know much about the United Nations or how it's composed, you might be led astray by what's called this anchoring bias. Now again, anchoring is a bias when left unchecked. It again, just like availability can be quite useful as a cognitive heuristic, however, anchoring is useful for saving us time when we don't have to calculate and think very carefully about stuff in our environment. Of course, it can be used against us. It is well known by corporate America that if you throw a salary out during negotiations, individuals tend to hover around that salary rather than to shoot very much or for very much more. And so this is a way that it's sort of a strategy that human resources often deploys in negotiations over salary to keep salaries down below a certain amount so that they don't have to spend too much money on new hires, and they can kind of control the negotiations from the outset. Now, if you're stuck in that and you really just fall into that hovering around whatever number's handed to you, your tendencies towards this bias would have been exploited by HR in this case. So what's the theme here? So generally speaking, we often provide intuitive responses to problems we experience in the real world. And this is true for questions of recall, like we were just looking at. And in these preceding questions, you're attempting to recall information and reason based on that recall. Now, this sort of intuitive responses that we tend to see is not the only way we think. We also think in more methodical ways. Like sometimes we think quickly, and judgment is just emerges from us, perhaps based on expertise, often just based on the fact that we don't have time to think very carefully. Nevertheless, there's another sort of broadly described way in which we engage in the world, which is sort of slower thinking, more methodical thinking. And it can be, I'll illustrate here. So reflect on the following puzzle. It's a baseball bat and a ball. Together they cost $1.10. Now the bat costs $1 more than the ball. Question, how much does the ball cost? Giving you just a few minutes, but not too much. Observe. Now, I suspect many of you had an intuitive response. Before you blurt it out at your screen, because I can't hear you, just let me walk you through this. So, a baseball bat and a ball cost $1.10 together. That is to say, the price of the bat plus the price of the ball equals $1.10. So, what is the price of the ball? Well, $1 plus the price of the ball is the price of the bat. If we let X be the price of the ball, then it's $1 plus X as the price of the bat. And we can run a little calculation here. It ends up being the case that a nickel, the price of the ball, is a nickel. Which is to say that the price of the bat is $1 more than the ball, because $1 plus 5 cents plus 5 cents is $1.10. Now that was much more analytic. That sort of problem solving, it's not just recall, it doesn't really lend itself to quick intuitive judgments, although I suspect some of you did have a quick intuitive judgment about what the answer was, and it was likely mistaken. But we can engage this with a bit of math, just moving some numbers around, thinking about variables, and answering precisely by calculating. This is, again, more of the slow thinking. So I've got here displayed here this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, by Daniel Kahneman, who's an economist who investigated sorts of cases like this, both in terms of like quick recall and intuitive judgment versus the more analytic or methodical approaches. And what he came to in his research is, just as I was describing a moment ago, broadly speaking, there being two systematic ways of thinking, system one and system two, where the first is that instinctive, quick, emotional, automatic, requiring little or no effort sort of thinking. And the second system is that slower and the one that involves complex decisions. It's more logical, more deliberate, and more effortful. It also requires a lot more attention and consciousness. Now, as I've said here, it's often valuable to rely on cognitive heuristics, such as anchoring and availability. And these heuristics, and I'm calling them heuristics insofar as they're beneficial in your cognitive life, and they inhabit a sort of system one area of thinking. Now, if you can imagine just for a moment how challenging daily life would be if you had to engage in system two thinking all the time, you can see why it's beneficial that we have both of these approaches to the world. And so you can't stop every moment and think consciously about whose turn it is at a four-way stop, or on which side of the hall you should walk, or how much ice cream you should have at dessert, or whether you should open a scammy-looking email. A lot of the things we do in our daily life are born of more of that instinctive way of thinking. Now, importantly, you can, and we often have, many of us do in our lives, we can take what is initially methodical and careful and deliberate thinking, and over time, in practice and habits, convert that or massage that or develop that or curate that in our brains into that system one thinking. So there was a case, or was a time, no doubt, for all of you that you had to think very carefully about very basic math. But I suspect very basic math is very basic to you now. Right? It becomes something of a habit, something that you can just have a knee-jerk answer to, calculate at least small sums in your head without thinking about it at all. I know for my part, I've studied logic for over a decade now. I can just kind of see arguments that are valid and arguments that are invalid without thinking very much about it. But I do recall a time years ago where I had to think very carefully, and it took a lot of practice. But over time, like that methodical thought became easier and easier until it eventually became something of an instinct. And the cognitive biases emerge when those habits of thinking that you have are which get you through the day and provide or allow you to move through the day smoothly without having to stop every 5 minutes and think carefully about the world. When those are in the wrong context, or at least deployed in the wrong context. Like anchoring can be very beneficial for you, but in the wrong context, it can be very harmful for you. Availability can be quite valuable to you on a day-to-day basis when you need to do quick recall or answer questions rapidly and you don't have time to make methodical calculations about the results. But when in the wrong context, availability can be detrimental. It can lead you astray. For example, if you're being asked a question about how many K's are in a word. Now, the stakes are lower there, but stakes aren't always so low. But listen, methodical reflection can help us avoid such cognitive trends and facilitate more intentional engagement with the world, which is quite valuable in high-stakes situations. Now, what do I mean? So, recall the National Intelligence Estimate. When we discussed this in the context of a war with Iraq following 9/11, this was the NIE that was produced over Iraq's continuing program for weapons of mass destruction. And despite in this stating that intelligence agencies had limited information about the potential counterintelligence in Iraq at the time, tentative conclusions were drawn that Iraq continued its weapons of mass destruction program. Now, as we discussed, this was not exactly accurate, or certainly not accurate to the conclusions being drawn. There was, and from what I understand, has been roundly criticized as a bit of a failure in national intelligence assessments. And so one of the consequences of this evaluation was there's a reflection on how there had been a failure to evaluate adequately alternative hypotheses that had been raised. If you recall, there were some alternative hypotheses raised in the document, some alternative explanations for, say, putative evidence that weapons of mass destruction production was going on in Iraq at the time. But there was not a detailed or careful enough or methodical enough evaluation of those alternative hypotheses and the conclusions drawn from them. Now, this led to Hoyer here in the Psychology of Intelligence Analysis proposing an analytic process for investigating or refuting hypotheses, and it's designed to avoid the pitfalls of quick intuitive judgments that Hoyer and others at the time believed had led to the NIE's failures. So in this ACH, this analysis of competing hypotheses strategy, he's providing a step-by-step strategy for cultivating methodical, reflective intelligence gathering. Now, again, as I've said, it's designed to avoid pitfalls of his quick intuitive judgments with step-by-step strategies, which is to say this is focused on that kind of system 2, careful, analytic thinking, as opposed to that system 1, quick, intuitive judgment thinking. Now, it consists of 8 steps. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time walking you through each of these because I'm not teaching you how to be an analyst, but I will, just to give you an idea of the sort of analysis it goes into, we'll walk through these very, at least a little quickly. So first, in the first step, you'll gather groups of analysts with different backgrounds and perspectives together and have them throw out hypotheses regarding some given intelligence task or some idea that they're supposed to be investigating, and they will then refine the resulting list of brainstormed hypotheses to no more than 7 that the group will then analyze, and they will designate those hypotheses that are not to be analyzed as unproven and sort of put them aside for the time being. In the next step, they will list evidence in favor of and against each hypothesis. And they'll note the absence as well as the presence of evidence, because either can be impactful. They'll, in addition, include assumptions about the intentions and goals and motives and standards behind both their evaluation and assessment of the evidence, so that everybody's on the same page about why they're weighing things in certain ways or why they think certain arguments or evidence is in favor of or against some given hypothesis. They also consider these hypotheses individually and then connect them to evidence in favor of or against them. In the context of what they call this hypothesis versus evidence matrix. As you see on the left, you see evidence is lined up on that first column, and then across you have hypotheses. If you look just here in the first column row with a minus sign, you see a hypothesis that users are not on iOS devices. And sort of evidence you can see over on the left is that a given percentage of users are on iOS devices, and that percentage here presumably is high enough to make it so that this is counter evidence to the claim that users are not on iOS devices. In each case, as you're working through this evidence hypothesis matrix, you evaluate the relationships between a given piece of evidence row by row in each hypothesis in the matrix. And you say it's either consistent with, or give it a plus or C, or inconsistent, i.e., give it a minus or an I, or irrelevant, like a question mark or an NA. And they say that evidence in this case is diagnostic when it influences judgments about the plausibility of some hypothesis. That is, it has a plus or a minus. And note, I'll recall we've discussed this time and time again, but I characterize evidence as impactful on beliefs that one has, either for or against certain beliefs. And so this is just in line with that assessment. Evidence impacts beliefs, i.e. it influences judgments about the plausibility of various hypotheses. Now, continuing on in the analysis of competing hypotheses, you see reflection on wording of hypotheses and continue in the consideration of alternative presentations. I also consider combining hypotheses or splitting hypotheses into multiple hypotheses and then deleting irrelevant evidence, although they save it on a separate list. And so you see they're kind of methodically, carefully working through what the evidence they have, the hypotheses they have, so they can get clearer and clearer and clearer about what weighs in favor or against certain positions. Now, extracting conclusions and counterexamples is also part of this. They review the evidence that will allow you to reject hypotheses and do so in a step-by-step procedure. So hypotheses with the most inconsistency scores are likely the worst explanations, for example. Those with the fewest are likely the best. Hypotheses with the most consistency marks are plausible explanations, and those with the fewest are implausible. And they also reflect on the following sorts of questions, like are there questionable assumptions underlying some given interpretation of a hypothesis, or might there be alternative explanations, or might the evidence gathered and used be incomplete or misleading, etc. And they provide clear answers to these questions and make them clear to all analysts involved in the discussion. Finally, then they report these conclusions to provide decision makers relative likelihoods of alternative explanations for presenting hypotheses, and then they give them contingency plans as well in the event that they are mistaken. So they try in their best to be specific about how likelihood is presented as well, saying, for example, something is probably true could mean like 55% likely or 90% likely, so they have to be careful about this. If you recall in that NIE, for the Iraq's continuing weapons of mass destruction program, there were words all over the place of estimation, like likely or maybe or possibly, and there was no assessment or nothing clear, at least in the document, about what exactly was meant by these highly ambiguous terms. Now, this is, again, an analytic strategy that was developed after reflection on, failures of intelligence analysis in the field. ACH was designed, as I said, to avoid pitfalls of quick intuitive judgment, but more specifically, it was designed to guard against confirmation bias and serial position effects that influences analyst thinking. Again, that slow methodical or analytic strategy deployed here for that purpose. What are serial position effects? So this is a disposition towards recalling initial and most recent items provided in a sequence. I mean, if you've just recently seen something, it's more likely for you to be influenced that. For example, this is how like Google page ranks work. This is how e-commerce works, or product reviews. The most recent time you've been on Yelp and seen a review is the one that you're most likely to recall. The initial, it's composed here of the primacy effect and the recency effect. So the primacy effect being initial items are stored in long-term memory more efficiently, and then the recency effect being that last few items are still in workable memory and readily available. So if you recall, when we talked about like the sort of memory limitations that we humans have in our cognitive economy, we have like working memory, which allows us to kind of hold things in memory for a short amount of time and manipulate them and think carefully about them, and without like committing them to either short-term or long-term memory. And then on the other hand, we have this short-term and long-term memory. Short-term being able to like hold something in memory without focusing on it for, a few minutes, or maybe like 10 minutes at a time, but then not committing it to long-term memory. And then the long-term memory being where you store information that you can recall and come back or return back to much later, maybe even years later. So with that in mind, the recency effect is just simply the fact that you can hold information, or you would be holding most recently seen information in your working memory than you would any other. And the primacy effect, again, just being an observation in this case that the beginnings of lists, for instance, the initial sequence of items is what is most often stored in your long-term memory more than anything else in the list. So you see, again, restaurant menus, the first thing you look at that's likely to be stored in your long-term memory more than anything else you look at. Now, if you've just looked at, on the other hand, something on the restaurant menu, then it's very likely that if you're thinking about food or trying to decide on something, what you just looked at will still be in your working memory and still operate in a way that influences your judgment. TV cliffhangers as well also play into this. You see a cliffhanger, you see it's right at the end, focused on it, can't stop thinking about it. What do they do in the next episode? They hit you with the beginning. They just remember or remind you of where you were. They put that right in your long-term memory. So it's kind of a one and two punch here for why they're so compelling. Now, on the other hand, I mentioned, kind of confirmation bias was also in target for ACH. And confirmation bias is a disposition to seek information that supports rather than rejects existing beliefs. And this typically involves interpreting evidence in a manner that confirms those beliefs rather than denies it. And so many of us do have this tendency. We tend to seek out information that aligns with our beliefs or supports them. Keeps that, if I go back to a previous metaphor, that web of beliefs that holds all of our, views in mind, or like connects up with webs of desires and webs of hopes, that kind of consistency throughout. We want to maintain that the best we can, or at least we are disposed to maintain that as best we can. And so we seek out information that aligns with those viewpoints or aligns with those complicated webs that we form, rather than disconfirms. Disconfirming things you may even feel viscerally can be quite painful. People don't like to hear when they're wrong or when some deeply held conviction is mistaken. Examples of this are all over the place. Like social media feeds tend to be conformant, right? Echo chambers all over the web, right? People tend to gravitate towards those who agree with them. Also social, or not just social media, but also in political convictions or ideological divides, you can see this as well. I'll give you an example. So in 2020, then President Donald Trump issued an executive order banning new downloads of TikTok to U.S. devices. This is Executive Order 13942, and it was alleged in that order that TikTok was gathering data on U.S. citizens, which was being shared by the parent company of TikTok called ByteDance in Beijing. Now, responses to the TikTok ban were quick. It's right to be suspicious of the Chinese, said James Lewis, But I'm not sure TikTok is a good intelligence tool for them. Just dismissing this. So uh, there were discussions over whether there's an acceptable level of risk that would let TikTok continue to operate. And as you can see, TikTok executives made quite a bit of a push to make it so that they were not banned. Now, in 2021, President Joe Biden revoked Executive Order 13942, effectively lifting the TikTok ban. And President Biden ordered, in this case, a more deliberate and methodical investigation into TikTok data sharing practices. You can see a snippet of the order here. Now, this was in response to a large public outcry as well as lobbying going on that said, they believe that Donald Trump's executive order moved too quickly, and that he, in banning TikTok, he hadn't done enough. He hadn't given due diligence to the facts on the ground, and so President Biden was moved to do just that. Now, since then, many other people have jumped on board on the same train that President Trump was on in observing the dangers associated with TikTok. TikTok collecting excessive amounts of data on users. ByteDance planned to use TikTok to monitor the physical location of specific American citizens. FBI directors raising issues. And you see in February 27, 2023, as painful as it is for us to say, if Donald Trump was right, we could have taken action that had been a heck of a lot easier than trying to take action in November 2022. The sooner they bit the bullet would have been the better. And there was a memorandum to the heads of executive departments and agencies, as you see, that no TikTok on government devices should be allowed. And that was again in February 27th, 2023. So after Biden had lifted the ban. And if you're following the news now, then you see, let's see, actually, tomorrow, tomorrow, 9/23/2024, the courts are hearing a case about an appeal to the TikTok ban that's currently being unraveled. So we'll see how that plays out. Now again, as I was saying, so ACH was designed where its targets here were focusing on confirmation bias that can occur in the intelligence cycle, as well as serial position effects that can influence analysts' judgment. Now, this requires, as you'll see this in Whitesmith's book in this Cognitive Bias and Intelligence Analysis, which was part of the reading for this course, you'll see that at least evidence indicating that impacting serial position effects requires targeting long-term memory. So again, you recall the serial position effects worked on this balancing act between the long-term memory storage of recent items as well as short-term or working memory storage of what you've most recently seen. And so to really target serial position effects, the idea is that you should be targeting long-term memory. And impacting confirmation bias requires targeting when the focal hypothesis, like the ideal hypothesis, the thing that you're, going to be championing or think that's really captured your attention is formed. You target when that, i.e. in the initial stages of information processing, as opposed to when all information available has been processed. Now you may. This doesn't exactly line up if you're following along with the analysis of competing hypotheses strategy, which involves a lot of gathering, brainstorming hypotheses, lining them up, and evaluating them one by one. And so this doesn't, for example, engage directly long-term memory or how long-term memory changes or how it gets updated. It also, instead of targeting specific focal hypotheses and when they're formed, it sort of puts all the information on the table and then asks agents to analyze it. So as far as Whitesmith's empirical evaluations go, Martha has claimed in this book that ACH has no mitigating impacts on confirmation bias or serial position effects. The issue being that confirmation bias and serial position effects seem to stem from analytic conditions that produce a force towards forming a focal hypothesis as early as possible, which is just another roundabout way to say what I was gesturing at a moment ago, that the very nature of ACH is not such that it addresses or targets the long-term storage of items in memory or when the focal hypothesis is formed. I'll go a little further though. I'm going to add a little bit more to Whitesmith because while I think the empirical research is valuable and useful, and I think it's onto something, I do think Whitesmith is not being exactly charitable to the intelligence analysis process or ACH. And so Whitesmith claims that ACH is ineffective at preventing confirmation bias, but does note that awareness of the occurrence of cognitive bias is itself an effective mitigation strategy. And that does make sense, but it also doesn't explain why ACH is ineffective. Now, I think a lot of this has to do with system one thinking. So if ACH is very much a system two thought process, but most of the time what we're engaged in, most of the time what we do, whether intelligence analyst or not, is system one thinking. That's how we get through the world. Now, I think, and I've heard this from many analysts actually who I've talked to about this, they tend to say something like the same thing, which is actually applying ACH is challenging. And a lot of them don't really do it. The results are uncertain. The methodology, importantly, doesn't really provide explicit guidance on when experts are to use their expertise. Now, all of these features coupled together seem to provide something of an explanation for why ACH is ineffective. Let me explain a little more though. So when there's this famous study, the Dreyfus brothers, in a famous study that they tested expert pilots and novice pilots, and what they were doing in this study was that they had expert pilots provide guidance for those novice pilots in the form of step-by-step procedures for how to fly a plane, and then when following such guidance, it was shown that novice pilots perform significantly better than control groups without such guidance. However, when the expert pilots were given the guidance from other expert pilots, they ended up performing significantly worse than they would have otherwise. One of the lessons taken away from this is that expertise is not very easily written down in steps. It's not really something you can follow in a step-by-step procedure. When an expert, for example, baseball player swings a bat, they don't really think through the steps. They just swing. They're in flow. And when an expert analyst judges information as relevant or impactful, they don't always need to walk through the steps. They just see it. It's part of their expertise. Whitesmith paints this picture of whether to leverage analytic versus intuitive methods and having ACH in the analytic side and then just kind of gesturing in these intuitive methods on the other. But intuitive approaches are not just these off-the-cuff knee-jerk reactions from analysts trained and untrained or experienced or unexperienced. Analysts arguing or compiling the NIE weren't just looking at each other and thinking or saying perhaps explicitly, I know this is true or I know that is true. They were providing judgments but evidence and justification for those positions. And I suspect in many cases, just like it is the case when philosophers are arguing or analysts are arguing or anybody at a high level of like intellectual rigor or depth is concerned, at some point, sometimes it is quite challenging to articulate clearly what your justification is for your position, even though you're right, even though your expertise tells you you're right and you're pulling from some deep well of knowledge that may not be accessible to those in the room, but because of where you've been and who you are and what sort of intellectual or cognitive habits you have, you're actually picking up on the right answer. Intuitive approaches involve expertise, especially in the context that Whitesmith is concerned with. That's system two thinking that has been habituated into system one thinking. Now, better guidance here would both raise awareness of cognitive heuristics and biases we've been discussing, namely like the heuristics that help you get through the day, but then how they might turn into biases if left unchecked. It'll also provide analysts recommendations on when to leverage expertise and when not. Or they would make it easier for analysts to know when expertise should be leveraged and when it shouldn't. Now, really, only maybe the first part is provided by the analysis of competing hypotheses. We can even do better than that, though. I think specifically in the context of the course on ontological engineering. So we've seen some of this, like awareness, right? Bringing bias into the loop. We've got a human in the loop throughout the intelligence cycle, and they know that we bring bias into it. How do we maintain awareness of this sort of thing? Well, forming habits of recognitions and of those biases and heuristics to address them is a good first step. And we have some cognitive process ontology representations of these sorts of things that can help codify the various biases or help codify what's going on in the processes that we're engaged in when we're processing information or analyzing or producing it, whether representation of believed or measurements or confidence that we have. And recall, there's this picture, we have this cognitive representations in the head and a model of cognition, as well as an investigative process and then representations that are believed. This helps keep us straight about what's going on in our own cognition as we're forming beliefs and making judgments about content out in the world. And this helps bring us closer to that awareness of the heuristics that we have, the ways our heuristics can go sideways, and how bias might creep in. There's also linked up in other knowledge representation circles that we haven't discussed here, but existing codex, in this case a cognitive bias codex, that we can tie directly to the cognitive process ontology, which this is a characterization or classification of a whole range of biases based on Wikipedia, like how we store memories or reduce events and lists to their key elements. And there, as you can see here, there's a serial position effect right there, primacy effect. So even being able to search this or organize this information in a way that can be linked up to a broader picture of human cognition, I mean, that scaffolding makes it easier for humans to understand and makes it easier for us to be aware of this sort of information, which can in turn have positive impacts on analysts as they're engaged in the intelligence cycle. Now, that's sort of like cursory, preliminary stuff. I mean, awareness is good, but we can do better. Now, I don't know if in this course we can get to the level where if we can provide analysts recommendations exactly on when and how to use expertise. I'm not sure what course would be able to provide that. That seems like a very specific sort of training that you'd have to do in domain context where that expertise would be leveraged. But I think we can do something nearby, which is make it easy for analysts to know, or at least easier for analysts to know when expertise should be leveraged and when it shouldn't. And how do we do that? Arguments. Recall, the analysis of competing hypotheses involves argumentation, counterexamples, conclusions, evaluations of sensitivity, critical evidence, etc. And we've discussed, at least in passing, in this model of cognition, there's a move from the investigative process and judgment into beliefs. And so what supports this, or what gets you there? What's the lubricant that moves you from that thought bubble into beliefs? Or evidence and argument. Now, arguments are fundamentally used for persuasion. And this is a point at which intelligence analysis dovetails with ontology engineering. Because ontologies provide an avenue for understanding, the explainability of evidence, the tracking the uses of evidence, and the traceability, that is the tracking the impacts of evidence on other evidence, which is to say, ontologies provide an avenue for understanding how persuasion operates. The proposal is to deploy ontological representations of arguments within the intelligence cycle in the interest of making explicit the implicit justifications used throughout the cycle, and connect these ontological representation of arguments to contemporary fact-checking strategies in the interest of filtering good from bad justification and arguments. And then clarifying these justifications and arguments, the idea here is that it makes it easier to know when and how to apply expertise, because you have cleared off the riffraff. You are now clearly seeing the evidence for and against things in deductive, inductive, or abductive ways. So recall, those are the three sorts of arguments that we have in scope here. Arguments that are either where the conclusion follows deductively, like logically, without fail from the premises, or inductive, where the conclusion as outstripping the premises, but you can see that there's support for it in the premises, and then abductive, where you're reasoning to the best candidate explanation based on the information you have. Again, clarifying justifications and arguments, not just the justifications, but the arguments themselves, makes it easier to know when you can use your gut reaction, your focus, your expertise to support giving premises that in turn support conclusions. This is, in fact, just a species, at least in my experience, of the sort of argumentative habits that we get into in philosophy departments. We make our arguments as explicit as possible, writing them down almost in premise and conclusion form, so that the justification just kind of hangs there and we can see the logic pristinely and very clearly. And when you do that, it's very hard to slip. It's very hard to miss anything, because you know when an argument holds and when it doesn't. And this is also one of the reasons why it's so challenging and hard to maintain good arguments in practice in the real world, because we're so often liable to make mistakes when we do this sort of careful reasoning. But at the end of the day, we're better for it. Now, this is, as it probably sounds, quite involved. It can be quite challenging to write out all the steps, arguments, all the premises, conclusions, and the justification that goes along with it, and often characterized in it itself in terms of arguments. So how do we ease the burden here so that we can allow or facilitate the use of expertise in these environments while staring at all of this morass or complex landscape of arguments and persuasion or arguments and justification that we see before you. But, to be fair though, I know that standard intelligence analysis does appear to regularly include argument identification and inference checking. The proposal here, though, is to take it quite a bit further and to leverage ontological representations to facilitate machine-supported engagement with arguments and justification. I see the scaffolding that goes on in the training manuals. I see the level of depth, and it's better than most for sure. It's at least as good as education in like critical thinking or logic seminars and whatnot. But logicians could do better too, like especially when the stakes are so high, right? Like, and how do we do that? Leverage machines. We need to leverage as much automation as we can and much machine support as we can. And how do we do that here? Well, ontological representation, so the machines can understand some aspect of what we understand and take off that cognitive burden. So again, so expertise can shine through. Now for that, we of course need to be precise about the domain of argumentation, which will take us on a slight detour. I hope you like arguments, because you're about to get your fill. Arguments in the intelligence cycle. Here's a complex argument before you about Andrew in El Paso. A lot of things are going on. It's complex. There's argument creation. There's acts of inferring, etc. There's an argument itself, and there are things that are created, and there's inputs and outputs. I think an ontology of argument should accurately represent entities and relationships within its stated scope of the following sort. It should distinguish sentences from their contents, and sentence contents from what they're about, and also their roles within arguments, as well as permitting representations of multiple sentences and content types, and allow for the depiction of complex arguments. Now, what do I mean by these things? So, sentences are grammatical entities that are often tied to written or concretized sentences. And then statements or sentence contents, as far as we're concerned here, are the sorts of copyable patterns that are about things that are not just about the grammar. And then collections of sentence contents or collections of statements, those are the things that comprise arguments. So when I say, for example, that sentences are distinguished from their contents, what I mean is that the grammatical things, those grammatical structures, those conventions and those patterns that we use all the time to convey information, they're separate from the information that we often use to convey, or that we're often using those grammatical forms to convey. The cat is on the mat, in a sense, and at least the sense of a sentence is about the structure of the sentence. And in another sense, it is about a little fur ball on a mat, right? So there are two different things at least to keep in mind, and they work together to when we convey information or we convey meaning through or verbally. We also distinguish, as I said just here in this example, the sentence contents from the things they're about. So the content of a sentence, the content in the abstract of the sentence, the cat is on the mat, is, if correct, about some little hairball on a mat, right? Just like the sentence content of Schnee's Weiss is the same as the sentence content of Snow is White, and they're both about snow. Notably, though, different sentences, different grammatical structures. An expression consists of patterns of character shapes in a language, such as a string of characters comprising this clause, and a concretized sentence is a subclass of expression, instances of which satisfy some conventional rules of grammar. And those concretized sentences are the things that you would see written down. And both, though, are distinguished from statements, which are information content entities whose instances are the contents of concretized sentences. And these, for example, the concretized sentence, Susan is happy, expresses the statement that Susan is happy, which is plausibly about Susan's jocularity. Argument ontology as well must distinguish sentence contents from their roles within an argument. So you see here you had there's an argument creation act, and then there's an act of inferring as well. And there's also a statement like, if Andrew is in the Prado, then Andrew is in Madrid, and that is the input of an act of inferring, as well as Andrew is in the Prado. And then there is another statement which is the output of this act of inferring, which is Andrew is in Madrid. And these are different roles. These statements, that is, are taking on different roles in the argument. To make this even clearer, why we need such a distinction, the following argument is valid. God exists, therefore God exists. If the premise is true, then the conclusion is true, and that's what it means to be valid. But we have two identical premises, right? The contents are the same. We have two lines that are the same. The content, that is the same. You have a premise and a conclusion, but they're both meaning the same thing. What distinguishes them in the argument? Well, just that one is a premise and one is a conclusion. One plays a certain role in the argument and the other plays a different role. Arguments now are ordered collections of statements involving premises, suppositions, and a single conclusion. At least that's how we'll define it here. Now, premise is a statement in a relation to an argument as the affirmed input of an act of inferring, while the conclusion is a statement part of an argument that's the output of an act of inferring. And the suppositions are inputs of act of accepting, which is weaker than affirming. You're not committing yourself to it, you're just saying if something is true, in which an agent entertains a statement as true or false, independent of whether they believe it or not. We can suppose whatever we want, and that doesn't have to be a premise in an argument. I could suppose 2 + 2 = 6, but if I asserted in an argument as a premise that 2 + 2 = 6, well, you should probably stop listening to me, because you should never assert such things. In addition, because of this, we allow in argue as well, and we should, the representation of multiple sentences and content types. And so this is what we do with the premises, suppositions, etc. We also allow for it's not displayed here, but we allow for arguments that involve imperatives, like attack now if the weather is fine. The weather is fine, therefore attack now. There are imperatives or commands or something of that sort, rather than assertions. So different multiple sentence and content types are permitted, and they should be permitted in this sort of argument ontology, because arguments come in many shapes and forms, not just in the straightforward if P then Q, P therefore Q sort of depiction. Just as importantly, perhaps more importantly for our goals here, because we can get so much work done out of this, but depiction of complex arguments is crucial. It's key to an argument ontology. Why? Well, note in any complex argument you have a subconclusion. So a subconclusion is like a gateway into the main conclusion. So a subconclusion is part of a complex argument. It's either affirmed or accepted in an act of inferring, or affirmed or accepted output in an act of inferring in an argument distinct from the first. And both arguments must be parts of the complex argument in this case. So you have to have at least two arguments. And then you have to have act of inferring, premises, conclusions, suppositions, etc. And then both of those arguments have to be part of the thing that is the complex argument. When you get that, you have subconclusions. Our complex arguments are built out of arguments. They're basically arguments that are built out of arguments. And because of that, because all arguments have some, or at least one conclusion, or most one conclusion, that means there are going to be multiple conclusions in a complex argument. Only one of them is the main conclusion. All the others are sub-conclusions that lead you into the main conclusion. In addition, we also must distinguish how arguments are used in the different ways that counter evidence for a conclusion may undermine different arguments in different ways. Classifying this stuff, these sorts of relationships like in opposition or supporting, I think is how ontologies can play with intelligence analysis and potentially even support things like the analysis of competing or hypotheses in the following way. So consider this application. So simple strategies of fact-checking out in the wild using machines like large language models, targeting certain databases. They will gather up claims and evidence pairs, and then they'll tag those claims and evidence pairs in databases indicating which evidence supports or whether the evidence supports or undermines the claim. So you can say, for example, you have pairs of data or pairs of information in a database, some of which are things like the elephant is gray, other things in other parts of the database of the sort that it's raining outside, or I'm wearing glasses, or the sun is bright and directly overhead. Some of this might be used as evidence to support the claim or undermine beliefs in the claim. So automated strategies that for fact-checking involve working through these sorts of claims that might be depicted in such databases, and then looking at evidence and then determining or tagging when those sorts of evidence and claim pairs bear this support or opposition relationship. And sophisticated models of these sorts attempt to provide missing evidence or correct claims that they see in the database. But each such strategy attempts to leverage claims and evidence, and claims and evidence, though, are often characterized in terms of arguments. Now, suppose some statement X in argument A conflicts with statement Y in argument B, resulting in a pair of options for claim and evidence of the sort you see, these four pairs. Now, I said it was crucial, important really, that there be a way to connect complex arguments to their argument parts, or arguments that build into complex arguments. We do this by parthood relations, so mereological relations. I say that arguments literally are parts of complex arguments, just like my hand is part of my arm. This literal parthood relation. Now you can connect the subparts of arguments then up by opposition or support, etc. relationships. Here, I'll depict it here. Say again, just to recall, like suppose statement X in argument A conflicts with statement Y in argument B. We have X, Y here. These are statements, evidence. We'll assert that X opposes Y in this case. Now we run through the options. X is, of course, mereological part of itself, but Y was, recall, part of the argument B, and X is part of the argument A. Y is, of course, part of itself. Now, what can we infer about the relationship between XB and AY? What can we infer about the relationship between AY and x, b? Well, before we get there, we know that x, b, and a, y are parts of the broader arguments a and b, right? Because x is part of a, x is part of a, and y is part of b. We can still ask this other question of whether a then opposes b. Now, let me put it to you this way. If x opposes y, and x is a part of a, then a should oppose y. I'll let you think about that for a second. Similarly, if x opposes y, and y is part of b, then x should oppose b. Lastly, because of the parthood relation moving its way up the lattice, if x opposes b and a opposes y, and x is part of a, and y is part of b, then a should oppose b. Now, does this happen all the time? Does this sort of relationship happen all the time? Not at all. No, it doesn't. But if we're sorting through lists of arguments, lists of claims and pairs and all that good stuff, and evidence, etc., and we want to narrow down or filter on the ones that are valuable to us, this is the sort of ladder structure that we should be looking for. If A does not oppose Y, just to play devil's advocate, so if A does not oppose Y, then at a minimum, A does not support X opposing Y. So think about that. I said over here, if X opposes Y, then A opposes Y. And I'm saying here, if A does not oppose Y, then at a minimum, it's because A does not support X opposing Y. So our assumption that X opposes Y, the thing we've held as a bedrock, if it is the case that A does not oppose Y, then A can't support or shouldn't support, or is probably not supporting X opposing Y. For example, suppose that Tom is at a grocery store, Y. And suppose that is opposed by Tom is at home, X. And suppose the latter is part of the following argument, A. If Tom lives in a grocery store, then he is at home. Tom lives in a grocery store, hence Tom is at home. Now this does not oppose Tom is at the grocery store. Why? Because line 2 of the argument A does not support that Tom is at home, X, opposing Tom is at the grocery store, Y. Again, as I said, if A does not oppose Y, then it's because, at a minimum, A does not support X opposing Y. This is a picture then. We've got cognition, maintaining awareness in intelligence analysis, in the loop of our bias and how it might influence the way we engage in the world, the way we evaluate evidence. But also now we have a picture of arguments, a very careful, rigorous picture of arguments and the various features and parts they have, as well as, and that can help us help inform how we understand reasoning and what we're engaged in. But also allow us to leverage machines to help automate some of that understanding, or help automate some of the sorts of, or filter in on the sorts of arguments that we should be focusing on out of that whole complex world of booming and buzzing arguments and evidence and claims and types and all that good stuff that are around us. We have a filter, and in doing so, in filtering this, we can help agents, analysts, I believe, identify more carefully, more clearly, facilitate at least with clarity when their expertise can be leveraged and at what points in that, I think. And because of the lack of guidance that an analysis of competing hypotheses or other analytic methods like that provides for leveraging such guidance or leveraging such expertise, I think this potentially could go some way in these ontological representations of helping to facilitate better analytic practices. But in summary, I'll say this and then close. Cognitive heuristics that are quite helpful in our daily lives can, if left unchecked, lead us to bias. ACH is a strategy deployed by intelligence analysts to address confirmation and serial position bias, though it's unclear the extent to which the strategy is effective. Now, I am arguing that explicit representations of arguments and justification in the intelligence cycle, not just in the way that intelligence agents do it now, but in a much more sophisticated, much more rigorous, machine-aided manner, will allow analysts to know when and where to leverage their expertise, rather than simply trying to find a formula and hoping for the best.